Before we begin, where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments. If you love inspiring stories of resilience and justice, make sure to hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more incredible tales. Your support helps us share these impactful stories with even more people. Now, let's get into it. The sun hung low over Raleigh, North Carolina, casting golden light across the manicured lawns of Oakbridge Estates. From a distance, the subdivision appeared to be the embodiment of the American dream: neat brick houses with identical porches, carefully trimmed hedges, and streets so clean they practically gleamed. Every mailbox was regulation black, every driveway was sealed without cracks, and every lawn was maintained at precisely the height specified in the community guidelines. But beneath this facade of perfection lurked something far less harmonious. Those who lived in Oakbridge Estates knew that the pristine appearance came at a cost: constant surveillance, relentless rule enforcement, and the ever-present threat of fines for even the smallest deviation from approved standards. At the center of this control sat Margaret Whitmore, though everyone in the neighborhood simply called her the President. As head of the Oakbridge Estates Homeowners Association, Margaret had transformed what was meant to be a volunteer position into something approaching authoritarian rule. She was a woman in her late 50s with platinum blonde hair styled in a severe bob, designer sunglasses that never left her face, and a wardrobe consisting entirely of pastel pantsuits that somehow managed to look both expensive and aggressively suburban. Margaret had lived in Oakbridge Estates since the development was first built 15 years ago. She'd watched the neighborhood grow from a handful of houses to a sprawling community of over 200 homes, and somewhere along the way, she'd decided that maintaining standards was her personal calling. What started as helpful reminders about trash can placement had evolved into a comprehensive surveillance operation that would have impressed a Cold War spy agency. No detail was too small for Margaret's attention. She kept detailed files on every property, noting infractions with the precision of a prosecuting attorney. A garden gnome placed 6 inches too close to the sidewalk. A car parked in a driveway overnight instead of in the garage. A child's chalk drawing on a driveway that hadn't been washed away quickly enough. Margaret documented everything, and her increasingly lengthy emails to residents had become the stuff of neighborhood legend. "Dear homeowner," one typical Margaret email began, "it has come to my attention that your recycling bin was placed at the curb 17 minutes before the approved 6 p.m. placement time on Wednesday evening. This constitutes a violation of Section 7, Paragraph 3, Subsection B of our community guidelines. Please remit payment of the $25 fine within 10 business days to avoid escalation to a $50 penalty." The neighbors had learned to comply rather than resist. Fighting Margaret meant endless emails, emergency HOA meetings, and the very real possibility of escalating fines that could reach hundreds of dollars. It was easier to follow her rules, no matter how arbitrary they seemed. But Margaret's oversight wasn't evenly distributed across Oakbridge Estates. Longtime residents noticed that she seemed to have favorite properties, usually owned by families who looked like her, who drove similar cars, who attended the same country club. And there were properties that received disproportionate scrutiny, though no one wanted to say out loud what everyone was thinking about the pattern. The community pool sat at the physical and social heart of Oakbridge Estates. Surrounded by a decorative iron fence and accessed through a gate that required a key fob, the pool was the neighborhood's crown jewel. Margaret had personally overseen the installation of security cameras around the perimeter, ostensibly to prevent unauthorized access. In practice, the cameras gave her another tool for monitoring who used the pool and when. On a warm Friday afternoon in late August, Margaret sat in her usual spot near the pool's entrance, iPad in hand, reviewing the latest batch of incident reports she'd compiled. She'd just finished drafting an email about someone's pool towel being the wrong shade of blue when she noticed something that made her sit up straighter. A black woman was swimming alone in the pool. Margaret's eyes narrowed behind her designer sunglasses. She didn't recognize this woman, which in Margaret's mind meant only one thing: trespasser. Never mind that Oakbridge Estates was home to several hundred people and Margaret couldn't possibly know everyone. Never mind that the woman had obviously accessed the pool through the locked gate, meaning she must have a valid key fob. In Margaret's worldview, there were people who belonged and people who didn't, and this woman clearly fell into the latter category. Margaret stood, smoothing her mint green pantsuit, and began walking toward the pool with purposeful strides. She was going to get to the bottom of this, and if her suspicions were correct, and Margaret's suspicions were always correct, at least in her own mind, she was going to have this trespasser removed from the property immediately. What Margaret didn't know was that the woman swimming peaceful laps in the pool was Dr. Jasmine Thompson, and Dr. Thompson was not just any resident of Oakbridge Estates. She was a member of the North Carolina State Senate, representing District 19, which included the very neighborhood Margaret presided over so zealously. And this chance encounter was about to set in motion a series of events that would fundamentally transform Oakbridge Estates in ways Margaret could never have anticipated. Dr. Jasmine Thompson surfaced from her backstroke, water streaming from her natural hair as she reached the pool's edge. It had been a brutal week in Raleigh, committee meetings that ran until midnight, contentious debates over healthcare legislation, and endless constituent calls about everything from potholes to property taxes. This swim was the first moment of peace she'd had in days, and she was determined to enjoy it. Jasmine had moved into Oakbridge Estates 3 months ago, specifically because she wanted a quiet place away from the Capitol building. Her townhouse was modest by the neighborhood standards, but it was hers, and it represented the kind of stability she'd worked her entire life to achieve. Growing up in Durham in a working-class family, Jasmine had put herself through college and law school before spending a decade as a civil rights attorney. Her election to the state senate at age 38 had been seen as a major upset, but Jasmine had built her campaign on genuine connection with voters and a reputation for getting things done. She'd chosen Oakbridge Estates partly for the pool. Swimming had always been her meditation, the one place where the constant noise of politics couldn't reach her. She'd used the pool several times since moving in, always during off-peak hours when she could have the space mostly to herself. As Jasmine prepared to begin another lap, she noticed a woman standing at the pool's edge, arms crossed, staring at her with undisguised hostility. The woman wore a pastel pantsuit that seemed wildly impractical for a pool environment and sunglasses so large they obscured half her face. "Excuse me," the woman called out, her voice carrying the particular tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed immediately. "I need to see your pool pass." Jasmine treaded water, confused. "My pool pass?" "All residents are required to display their pool pass while using the facility," Margaret said, consulting her iPad. "It's in Section 12 of the Community Guidelines." Jasmine swam to the ladder and climbed out, wrapping a towel around herself. She kept her voice calm and friendly. "I'm a resident. I used my key fob to enter through the gate." Margaret's lip curled slightly. "Key fobs can be borrowed or stolen. Do you have identification proving you live in Oakbridge Estates?" The question hung in the air, loaded with implication. Jasmine had encountered this particular brand of aggressive questioning enough times in her life to recognize it for what it was. She could feel her blood pressure rising, but years of legal training and political experience had taught her the value of staying composed. "My identification is in my bag," Jasmine said evenly, gesturing toward her belongings on a nearby lounge chair. "But I'm curious, do you ask every resident who uses the pool to show identification?" Margaret stiffened. "I enforce the rules uniformly." "Do you?" Jasmine asked. "Because I've been here several times over the past few months, and this is the first time anyone has questioned my right to use the pool." "Well," Margaret said, her voice taking on an even sharper edge, "we've had reports of unauthorized individuals accessing the pool. I take the security of our community very seriously." Jasmine recognized the coded language. She'd heard variations of it her entire life: unauthorized individuals, security concerns, reports from residents. It all translated to the same thing: you don't look like you belong here. "I'm happy to show you my identification," Jasmine said, walking toward her bag. "But I want to be clear that I'm doing this as a courtesy, not because you have any right to demand it." Margaret bristled. "As president of the HOA, I have every right." "Actually," Jasmine interrupted, her lawyer instincts kicking in, "you don't. HOA presidents don't have the authority to detain residents or demand identification without cause. What you're doing right now could be considered harassment. Margaret's face flushed red. No one spoke to her like this. No one questioned her authority in Oakbridge Estates. She was the president, and what she said went. If you refuse to cooperate, Margaret said, pulling out her phone, I'll have no choice but to call the police. Jasmine felt a chill despite the warm afternoon air. She knew how quickly these situations could escalate. She knew the statistics about police encounters. She knew that "swimming while black" had become its own category of viral videos, usually ending with someone in handcuffs or worse. That seems like an extreme response to someone using a pool they have every legal right to use, Jasmine said carefully. But Margaret was already dialing, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency. As she lifted the phone to her ear, Jasmine made a decision. She pulled out her own phone and began recording. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was faint but audible. Yes, I'm at the Oakbridge Estates community pool, Margaret said, her voice suddenly taking on a trembling quality that hadn't been there moments before. There's an individual here who I believe is trespassing. She's refusing to provide identification and becoming aggressive. Jasmine's eyebrows rose. Aggressive? She hadn't raised her voice once. But she understood what was happening. Margaret was crafting a narrative, building a case that would justify whatever happened next. Ma'am, can you describe the individual? The dispatcher asked. Black female, approximately 5'7", late 30s, Margaret said, as if she were describing a criminal suspect rather than someone swimming in a pool. Jasmine continued recording, making sure to capture Margaret's words and demeanor. If this situation was going to escalate, she wanted documentation. Within minutes, they heard sirens in the distance, growing louder. 2 Raleigh Police Department cruisers pulled into the parking lot, lights flashing. 4 officers emerged, hands resting casually on their duty belts as they approached the pool gate. Jasmine's heart hammered in her chest. This was the moment where everything could go wrong. She set down her phone, keeping her hands visible, and prepared to explain herself to officers who might or might not believe her. What neither Margaret nor the approaching officers knew was that Dr. Jasmine Thompson wasn't just familiar with the law, she had helped write some of it. Her work in the state Senate included criminal justice reform legislation, and she'd worked closely with law enforcement organizations across North Carolina. One of the approaching officers, Sergeant Michael Davis, was about to recognize the woman Margaret had reported as a trespasser. And when he did, the power dynamic Margaret had worked so hard to establish was going to shift in ways she couldn't have imagined. Sergeant Michael Davis had been with the Raleigh Police Department for 15 years, long enough to develop a healthy skepticism about calls involving suspicious persons in affluent neighborhoods. In his experience, these calls often had less to do with actual crimes and more to do with someone not matching the caller's expectations of who belonged in a particular space. As he approached the pool gate with his partner, Officer Jennifer Park, Davis took in the scene. A middle-aged white woman in a pastel pantsuit stood near the entrance, arms crossed, looking both self-righteous and agitated. Near a lounge chair stood a black woman in a swimsuit and towel, phone in hand, posture tense but composed. Officers, thank God you're here, Margaret began before Davis could even introduce himself. This woman has been trespassing in our community pool. I asked her to provide identification and she refused. She's been very aggressive and threatening. Davis glanced at the other woman, who raised her eyebrows slightly but said nothing. He'd dealt with enough false reports to know that aggressive often meant didn't immediately comply with demands. Ma'am, Davis said to Jasmine, using the professionally neutral tone he'd perfected over years of patrol work, can you tell me what's going on here? Jasmine took a breath, forcing herself to stay calm despite her racing heart. I'm a resident of Oakbridge Estates. I came to use the pool, which I accessed using my key fob. This woman approached me and demanded to see identification. When I questioned her authority to do so, she called 911. She's lying, Margaret interjected. She doesn't have a key fob. She must have snuck in when someone else entered. Actually, Jasmine said, reaching carefully toward her bag, I can show you my key fob right now, if that's helpful. Slowly, Officer Park said, her hand moving instinctively toward her service weapon. Jasmine moved with exaggerated slowness, pulling out a black key fob with the Oakbridge Estates logo. She held it up for the officers to see. Davis examined the fob, then looked at Margaret. This appears to be a valid resident key fob. Do you have any reason to believe it was stolen or borrowed? Margaret's face flushed. Well, no, but that doesn't prove she lives here. Plenty of people borrow key fobs from friends. Ma'am, Davis said, turning back to Jasmine, do you have identification that shows your address? I do, Jasmine said. My driver's license is in my bag. May I get it? Go ahead. Jasmine retrieved her wallet and handed her license to Davis. He studied it carefully, comparing the photo to the woman standing before him. The address listed was indeed in Oakbridge Estates. And then Davis looked at the name. Dr. Jasmine M. Thompson. His eyes widened slightly. He looked up at Jasmine, then back at the license, then at Jasmine again. Dr. Thompson, he asked, his voice changing from professional neutrality to something approaching respect. Yes, Jasmine said simply. Officer Park leaned over to look at the license. Her eyes widened too. Senator Thompson. Margaret's confident expression faltered. Senator. Jasmine nodded. I represent District 19 in the North Carolina State Senate. Oakbridge Estates is part of my district. The atmosphere shifted dramatically. Davis and Park exchanged glances that spoke volumes. Margaret looked confused, then suspicious, then gradually horrified as the implications began to sink in. Senator Thompson, Davis said, his tone now completely different, I apologize for the inconvenience. Obviously, you have every right to be here. Thank you, Sergeant, Jasmine said, taking back her license. She turned to Margaret, who now looked like she wanted the ground to swallow her whole. And just to be clear, I've been using this pool regularly since I moved into my townhouse 3 months ago. I'm not a trespasser. I'm your constituent. Margaret opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. I didn't realize. I mean, I've never seen you at any HOA meetings. That's because I work 60-hour weeks in Raleigh, Jasmine said evenly. I use the pool during off hours specifically to avoid crowds. But that doesn't make me any less of a resident. Davis turned to Margaret, and his professional courtesy had cooled considerably. Ma'am, in the future, I'd suggest verifying your concerns before calling 911. Making false reports wastes police resources and can be considered a criminal offense. Margaret's face went pale. I wasn't making a false report. I genuinely thought. You thought what? Jasmine interrupted. That I didn't belong here. That I couldn't possibly be a resident of your nice neighborhood. Let me guess, you don't see many people who look like me in Oakbridge Estates. That's not what Margaret stammered. Actually, that's exactly what this is about, Jasmine said, her voice calm but firm. This is about assumption and bias. This is about seeing someone who doesn't match your mental image of who belongs in Oakbridge Estates and immediately assuming they must be trespassing. Davis and Park stood awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. They'd responded to what they thought was a legitimate trespassing call and had walked into something far more complicated. Senator, Park said quietly, would you like to file a complaint about this incident? Jasmine considered. Part of her wanted to let it go, to chalk it up to an unfortunate misunderstanding and move on. But another part, the part that had spent her entire career fighting against exactly this kind of profiling, knew that silence would only enable future incidents. Not against the police department, Jasmine said. You responded to a call. But I will be addressing this with the HOA board. Margaret found her voice again. Senator Thompson, I apologize if there was a misunderstanding. I'm just trying to keep our community safe. Safe from what? Jasmine asked. From residents using the pool. From people who don't look like you. She let the questions hang in the air. The officers made their exit as quickly as they could, relieved to escape the increasingly awkward situation. As they walked back to their cruisers, Davis shook his head. That's going to be all over the news by tomorrow, he muttered. He was right. One of the other poolgoers had recorded the entire encounter on their phone, and within hours, it would be shared thousands of times with the hashtag #PoolPatrolPeggy, or in this case, #PoolPatrolMargaret. But the viral video was only the beginning. What happened next would reshape not just Oakbridge Estates, but community governance across the entire state. By Monday morning, Margaret Whitmore had become the face of HOA overreach and racial profiling. The video of her calling police on a sitting state senator had been viewed over 2 million times. Local news stations led with the story. National media picked it up. Margaret's phone rang constantly with reporters requesting comment, but she'd been advised by her lawyer to say nothing. The Oakbridge Estates HOA board called an emergency meeting for Tuesday evening. Margaret wanted to cancel it, to let the situation cool down, but the other board members insisted. They were facing a potential lawsuit, terrible publicity, and the very real possibility of state intervention in their community affairs. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a building that usually hosted birthday parties and book clubs. Tonight, it was packed with residents, media representatives, and several people Jasmine had invited, including representatives from the North Carolina NAACP and the state's Fair Housing Office. Margaret sat at the head table with the 3 other board members, all of whom looked profoundly uncomfortable. The board's attorney, a nervous young man named Derek Chen, sat beside them reviewing his notes. Jasmine arrived with her chief of staff, Marcus Reynolds, and her legislative counsel, Patricia Kim. She wore a professional navy suit and carried a folder thick with documents. She wasn't here as a victim seeking sympathy, she was here as a legislator prepared to enact change. This meeting will come to order, Margaret said, her voice unsteady. We're here to discuss the incident that occurred at the community pool on Friday afternoon. The incident where you racially profiled a state senator, someone called from the audience. Margaret flinched. I did not racially profile anyone. I was enforcing community rules. Which rules? Jasmine asked, standing. I've reviewed the Oakbridge Estates HOA bylaws extensively over the past weekend. There's no rule requiring residents to show identification at the pool. There's no rule requiring residents to display pool passes. You made up those rules on the spot because you didn't think I belonged here. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the audience. Senator Thompson, the board's attorney, interjected, perhaps we could discuss this in a more private. No, Jasmine said firmly. This needs to be public. Because this isn't just about me. This is about a pattern of discriminatory enforcement that's been happening in Oakbridge Estates for years. She opened her folder and pulled out several documents. Over the past 3 days, I've received testimony from 17 other residents of this community, residents of color, LGBTQ residents, residents who don't fit the particular mold that Mrs. Whitmore believes represents Oakbridge Estates values. Jasmine began reading from the testimonies. A black family fined repeatedly for their basketball hoop while white neighbors had identical hoops without incident. A Hispanic couple who received citations for minor lawn infractions that were ignored when committed by others. A same-sex couple who had been questioned about guest policy for hosting their friends, while heterosexual couples regularly had gatherings without scrutiny. With each example, Margaret shrank further into her seat. The other board members looked increasingly mortified. This is systematic discrimination, Jasmine continued. And it's not just morally wrong, it's illegal. Fair housing laws protect against this kind of selective enforcement. The question is, what is Oakbridge Estates going to do about it? The board attorney leaned over to whisper urgently to Margaret. She shook her head at first, but he whispered more insistently. Senator Thompson, Margaret said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, I want to apologize. I made a mistake. I let my assumptions cloud my judgment. Your assumptions, Jasmine repeated. Let's call them what they are, racial bias. You saw a black woman at the pool and your first thought wasn't "that's my neighbor," it was "that's a trespasser." You need to own that. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but Jasmine felt no sympathy. She'd been on the receiving end of these assumptions her entire life, and Margaret's tears weren't going to erase the harm she'd caused. I propose several changes, Jasmine said, addressing the full audience. First, Margaret Whitmore needs to resign as HOA President immediately. Applause broke out. Margaret looked stricken, but 3 of the 4 other board members were nodding. Second, the HOA board needs to undergo mandatory fair housing training. Third, we need to implement a formal complaint process with outside oversight. And fourth, I'm introducing legislation that will regulate HOA enforcement practices across North Carolina to prevent this kind of discrimination. The crowd erupted in cheers. Margaret stood abruptly and fled the room, her lawyer hurrying after her. The remaining board members voted unanimously to accept her resignation and to implement Jasmine's suggested reforms. As the meeting concluded, residents lined up to thank Jasmine, to share their own stories, to express relief that someone was finally holding the HOA accountable. Marcus approached Jasmine as the crowd thinned. That was powerful, he said. But you know this isn't over. Margaret has allies. She's going to fight back. Jasmine nodded. Let her try. I've dealt with tougher opponents in the legislature. Besides, the law is on our side. What Jasmine didn't know was that Margaret wasn't planning to fight back through official channels. Humiliated and furious, Margaret was about to make a series of decisions that would only deepen her troubles and ultimately transform her from a problematic HOA president into a cautionary tale about the consequences of refusing to confront your own prejudices. 6 months after the pool incident, Oakbridge Estates had transformed in ways that surprised even Jasmine. Margaret had not only resigned but had moved out of the neighborhood entirely, unable to face her former neighbors. Her house sold quickly, ironically to a young black family who'd been nervous about the community's reputation but were reassured by the recent changes. The new HOA board, elected in a special election, looked dramatically different from its predecessor. 3 of the 5 board members were people of color, and the president was Lucy Sanchez, a retired teacher who'd been one of the first to come forward with her own story of discriminatory treatment. The community pool became a symbol of the neighborhood's transformation. Where it had once been a space of tension and surveillance, it was now genuinely welcoming. Families of all backgrounds gathered there on weekends. The security cameras remained but were no longer used for profiling, they were simply security tools. Jasmine's legislation, the Fair Community Housing Enforcement Act, had passed with bipartisan support. It required HOAs across North Carolina to undergo fair housing training, established oversight mechanisms, and created penalties for discriminatory enforcement. Other states were already considering similar legislation. On a warm Saturday afternoon, Jasmine returned to the pool for the first time since the incident. She'd been nervous about it, unsure how she'd feel returning to the place where she'd been profiled and accused. But as she pushed open the gate, she was greeted by a crowd of neighbors who'd organized a Senator Appreciation Day. Children held signs reading, "Thank you Senator Thompson," and "Our Hero." Lucy Sanchez approached with a wide smile, carrying a gift basket. "We wanted to do something to show our gratitude," Lucy said. "You didn't just stand up for yourself, you stood up for all of us." Jasmine felt tears prick her eyes. "I just did what anyone should do, demanded to be treated fairly." "That's the thing," Lucy said softly. "Not everyone can. Not everyone has your platform, your resources, your courage. You used your privilege as a senator to help people who couldn't help themselves. That matters." As the afternoon progressed, Jasmine found herself swimming laps in the same pool where she'd been confronted, but this time the water felt different. Lighter. Freer. When she climbed out, she was approached by a young black girl, maybe 10 years old, who'd been watching her swim. "Are you really a senator?" the girl asked shyly. I am, Jasmine confirmed. My mom said you stood up to someone who was being mean to you. Jasmine smiled. I did. And you know what? Standing up for yourself is one of the most important things you can learn to do. The girl thought about this. Was it scary? Very scary, Jasmine admitted. But sometimes doing the right thing is scary. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. The girl nodded seriously, then ran back to her family. Jasmine watched her go, hoping that this child would grow up in a world where such confrontations were less necessary, where pools and neighborhoods and public spaces were truly open to everyone without question. That evening, as Jasmine prepared to leave, Lucy approached her again. There's something I want to show you, Lucy said, leading Jasmine to the pool gate. A small plaque had been mounted beside the entrance. It read, "This pool is a community space that belongs to all residents equally. We welcome diversity and stand against discrimination in all its forms. May all who enter here feel safe, respected, and valued." Below that, in smaller text, dedicated in honor of Senator Jasmine Thompson, who reminded us that true community is built on justice, not just rules. Jasmine read the plaque twice, emotion swelling in her chest. You didn't have to do this. Yes, we did, Lucy said firmly. Because this isn't just about remembering what happened. It's about committing to doing better. Every resident who comes through this gate needs to see that message and know what it means. As Jasmine drove home that evening, she reflected on the unexpected journey that had begun with a simple desire to swim in peace. She'd gone from being profiled as a trespasser to becoming a catalyst for community transformation. Margaret's attempt to exclude her had instead exposed and dismantled a system of discrimination that had operated quietly for years. The eighth story, the story beneath the surface, was often the one that mattered most. And in Oakbridge Estates, that story was now one of change, accountability, and hope. Thank you for joining this powerful journey about bias, courage, and the transformation that happens when people stand up against discrimination. When HOA President Margaret Whitmore called police on a woman at the community pool, she had no idea she was confronting a state senator who would not only defend herself but would change the system itself. If you found this story meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe to the 8th Dattery for more tales of justice and transformation. Every share helps us reach more people who need to hear these important messages.